Hello everyone, so today we're going to be going over Chapter 6, Learning, and we're going to discuss the basics of learning, classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. And first I just want to present the definition of what learning is, which is the acquisition of knowledge or skills through experience, study, or being taught that results in a relatively permanent and consistent change in behavior or knowledge. So we're either gathering skills or experiencing things, or we study things or being taught things that leads to a consistent and permanent change, either in your knowledge or behavior. But there is a difference between learned behaviors and unlearned behaviors, such as reflexes and instincts. A reflex is any motor or neuron reaction to a specific stimulus in one's environment. These tend to be simple and involve any body part. So this includes maybe grasping a glass of water, our eyes dilating to the sun, or a knee-jerk reaction. And then there are instincts, which are innate behaviors that are triggered by a specific event. These are more complex patterns of behavior. For example, there is an instinct in birds to migrate, and an instinct for us to react to fear when seeing a spider or maybe a snake. And these learned behaviors are different, or these unlearned behaviors are different from learned behaviors, such as classical conditioning. And classical conditioning is a process of learning through associating stimuli with a behavior or response. And you remember our good old friend Ian Pavlov from Chapter 1. He was best known for his dog study on classical conditioning. In his experiment, he noticed that a dog would naturally salivate to food before it ate the food. He called the dog salivating the unconditioned response, or the unconditioned stimulus, because the stimulus, which is the food, produced a natural response from the dog, which is called the unconditioned response. And so that natural response, such as salivating from the food, is called the unconditioned response, whereas the unconditioned stimulus would be the food itself. But Pavlov wondered if we can get a dog to salivate to maybe the sound of a bell in anticipation of eating his food. So he introduced a neutral stimulus, which was the sound of a bell, which didn't produce any response yet. So the bell is a new neutral stimulus that Pavlov is introducing. And by pairing the sound of the bell with the introduction of food, the bell became the conditioned stimulus. And the bell became the stimulus that elicits a response after repeatedly being paired with the uncontrolled stimulus, which, remember, was the food. So after repeatedly pairing the sound of a bell with food, the dog ended up responding and having a conditioned response to salivating by the sound of the bell. And so the new conditioned response is salivating from the bell instead of the unconditioned response, which was salivating from the food. And then we have higher order conditioning, which is a form of learning in which a stimulus is first made meaningful by being the conditioned stimulus, and then that stimulus is used as a basis for learning about a new stimulus that produces the same conditioned response. So here's an example of higher order or second order conditioning. So as we explained, but in this example, we are pairing an electric can opener with food to create a conditioned response to salivate in the response of a can opener. But if we add another stimulus that we pair with the electric can opener, so for example, a squeaky cabinet door, then after we successfully and repeatedly pair these two stimuli together, we can get the cat to also salivate to the sound of a squeaky cabinet door. So when a cat hears maybe a squeaky cabinet door or an electric can opener, it will produce a conditioned response to salivate. And with classical conditioning, there are general processes involved that explain these newly acquired responses. The first initial period is the acquisition phase, which you can see here, in which an organism learns to connect a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus. And this was done when the dog learned to connect the sound of the bell to salivating. And then the next phase is extinction, as you can see here, which is the decrease in the conditioned response. So the response of salivating to only the bell is extinguished over time. And this would eventually occur when the dog hears the bell and salivates every time until there is no food brought to eat. So the dog will eventually extinct this learned behavior to salivate to the sound of the bell because there is no food presented afterwards. And then over a period of time, if we pause this interaction, it could lead to spontaneous recovery, which is a return of the previously distinguished conditioned response following a pause or a rest period. So possibly after there was a rest period for the dog, and then it might hear a sound of the bell, it might salivate because the dog remembers that association between the bell and the food. And then slowly over time, again, that association will become extinct, and because the behavior is not being reinforced, so that behavior will then become extinct again unless it spontaneously recovers. And here's that example. So in the acquisition phase, we're pairing the neutral stimulus to the unconditioned stimulus. And then afterwards, after repeatedly salivating to the sound of the bell, the dog might produce an extinction period because after ringing the bell so many times, the dog notices that food isn't being brought. So the extinction phase goes down, and then after a pause, maybe about a day, it might hear the bell again and then spontaneously recover that association between the bell and the food and begin salivating again. But again, after not receiving any food, then it might return to the extinction period. And another component of classical conditioning is stimulus discrimination and generalization. Stimulus discrimination is when an organism learns to respond differently to various stimuli that are similar. So for example, the dog can learn to be able to discriminate between the sound of the bell and salivate. But then they might hear the sound of a horn and know that that sound is different from the sound of the bell, and so they won't salivate. And this is an example of stimulus discrimination because they're able to discriminate between the sound of the bell and the sound of a horn. And then stimulus generalization is the opposite of stimulus discrimination, such that an organism demonstrates the conditioned response, such as salivating, to stimuli that are similar to the conditioned response. So for example, the dog may salivate and produce this conditioned response of salivating to the sound of a bell, but also when they hear maybe an alarm clock that sounds similar to the bell, they might also create this conditioned response of salivating to the sound of an alarm clock, which sounds similar to the bell. So this is a stimulus generalization in which both sounds are generalized to produce the same response.